Okay, next we are going to look at the multiplexer. The multiplexer in Nest is based off of the 4051 chip, which is a classic multiplexing IC. Now, what a multiplexer is basically a switch. It, in this case, is an 8 input to 1 output switch, which allows you to take sequences, triggers, and numbers from various locations and send them to a single destination. If I were to take a trigger right here and plug that in, we would see its value on the left. And if we were to take this step sequence right here and plug that into another step, we too would see its value here on the left. Now, these, what you see are value offset sliders, just like we have with our voice outputs. They allow you to add to or subtract from anything you have currently got plugged into that location. The multiplexer is excellent for creating trigger sequences and also modulation and pitch sequences. I have got a couple of examples here. If we take a look at this MUX, there are zeros and ones currently being routed in, and as we know, these are triggers, and that will sound like this. I have got triggers going into the hi-hat, the drum, and this melodic voice, all being routed from this single multiplexer. And this second example, you can see larger value ranges, and this is being used currently as a pitch sequencer, and that will sound like this. Okay, that's all well and good, but how can we do this on our own? Well, why don't we start with routing triggers? So I am going to take some triggers from our clock and do increasingly fast triggers. All in all, this will get routed to the kick drum, and we need to advance our multiplexer with a clock input. Sounds like this. Let's take some more clocks. And we can change the direction that the multiplexer scans with a 1. We now see that it is moving backward. Now, with nothing connected to the clock input, we can manually scan through the MUX steps with the position input, which looks like this. Okay, and finally, let's take a look at the B mode. Now, the B mode is the classic operational mode of this 4051 chip. It uses A, B, and C inputs as bit addresses to select a step of the MUX. So, for example, a bit combination of 3 zeros would select the first step, step 0, and to select step 2, we would route 0, 1, 0. Why don't we try that ourselves? Which step was that? 0, 1, 0 is step 2. So taking a 1 and routing that to B gives us step 2. you can find this truth table in the manual for Nest. Now, how I like to use this B mode is to remix my sequence by feeding it random triggers. And this. What we just heard were 4 microgroup roots being triggered in concert, with their triggers being distributed by a demultiplexer. Now, the demultiplexer is the opposite of the multiplexer. It is a 1 input to 8 output switch, allowing you to take data and information from a single source and distribute it to up to 8 different destinations. Operationally, it is identical to the MUX, having a clock, position, reset, and direction input to control the step position in A mode, and the bit address A, B, and C with this truth table available in the manual in B mode. Now I'm going to just dive right in with some examples, starting with distributing a clock. So I'm going to take one clock and feed that both to the input and to the clock input. When I press play, you can see that this trigger is being distributed to each output in sequence. If I take a common pitch, feed that to the scale so that every voice receives the same pitch, I can distribute these triggers. And I have a different idea in mind. I would like to take the MIDI input and distribute its gate to the different voices so that I can manually advance the MUX, the Demux. So I will take the gate output of the MIDI input to both the Demux in and clock. Now every time I press a note, you can see that it will manually advance the Demux. I will feed the pitch into our common scale, and then plug these in. Play has got to be engaged to be able to hear anything. we can do a different pattern on the way back. Of course, we can also automate this so that we're not playing manually. Taking a sequence to the common input and taking a clock Now let's talk about the sample and hold. The sample and hold has two inputs, a trigger input and a data input. When the sample and hold receives a trigger, then the current number at the data input will be sampled and saved and output at the main out. I can demonstrate that with this patch right now. When I press play, then a trigger will be fired from the clock and this value will be saved. We can see a 27 at the main out. Now, when I press play, new trigger fired, new value sampled. We can, of course, sample moving data as well, like this. Now, you might have noticed that the data is moving at the output. That is because this sample and hold is actually a track and hold. As long as the input signal is high, then anything going into the data input will be tracked and followed. It is only when the output goes low that the last data value is sampled. So as long as the input is high, then we can be getting the output. This samples on the falling edge, not the rising edge. So this sample and hold is in fact a track and hold. Now the sample and hold has a secondary output, which is a random output. It has no correlation to the data input, so we can just sample away like this. What I'm doing right now is I'm limiting the output of the sample and hold to about 2 octaves. But you can see every time that this receives a trigger that a new random value is generated. If I bring this slew rate down, then the rate of transition or change from the previous value to the current value is slowed down so that it ramps from value to value. You can hear it's kind of ramping up and down. Okay, that's enough fun. The next modules we will explore are the shift registers, which are like super sample and holds. There are two shift registers in Nest. These are based on the 4015 IC, which is a classic 4-stage shift register. The shift registers in Nest are 8 stages. There are 2 of them. The first one is a binary shift register, only accepting 0s and 1s and outputting 0s and 1s. This is great for triggers and clocks. The second one is analog, accepting values of 0 to 127, and great for modulation and pitch. The second one can be switched to digital operation if you wish. Now this works just like a sample and hold, having a data input for values and a clock input to sample those values. I will clock it from my MIDI keyboard. Now when I press a note, then this 71 gets sampled into the first cell. I'm removing the data input, and when I press a new note, then that data gets passed to the next cell, to the next cell, and to the next cell. Now I will input some new information into the first cell, which gets sampled and passed along. When we get to the last cell, then this value is discarded. We can use this as sort of like a multi-tap delay for pitch, for modulation. And this creates very beautiful cascading sequences, very unlike what you would find from a step sequencer. Let's give that a listen by sampling with the shift register this step sequencer, in fact. I will hear what this sounds like dry first. Okay, that's nice. Now, if we plug the value into, trying to remove this cable, data into here, and the clock here, we can take the first output to the pitch of this voice. And we can take another output to a separate voice. And we will do the same with 3 voices. Now, where the fun with the shift registers come is when you use them both together, one for the triggers and one for the notes. So let's keep this plugged in fact. And now we are going to sample some triggers. I will use a fast clock and a slow data source. Now, when I press play, you can see these triggers cascading, and you can really get a sense for how this is similar to a multi-tap delay. Let's plug gate 1 here with some pitch. Gate 2. Number 3. And number 4. Now, a strategy for using the shift register is you generally want the data to be of a slower rate than the clock. The clock is basically the resolution of the shift register. If we go too slow, then you can see that we have some voices sounding at the same time, which might just be what you want, but if we go faster, then these triggers all occur in series. We can slow down the data input. Or speed it up so that there are no gaps in our sequence. Now, remember what happens when we feed the second shift register a gate? Now we can manually create chord changes. And they will all have a relationship because they're basically staggered in time. Like a multi-tap delay, just frozen in time, basically. But let's give this second one some movement. Let's take a look at our secondary functions. We have a write, read, and clear input. Now, I will first demonstrate write. Look at the cells. They each have a number, 59, 53, 45, and beside it, zeros. When I feed the write input with a trigger, it will write the current cell's values to these locations. We can think of this as a one preset memory. Now, if I were to feed the clear input with a trigger, all cells would be erased. And if I then read with a trigger, it will bring back that preset memory, and I can continue to manipulate it to shift those values and look at our new values 0, 0, 59, 53. I can now write this to our memory. And if I were to clear, then everything would return with a trigger. Okay, now we're going to talk about the converters. There are two converters, a digital to analog converter and an analog to digital converter. These are super interesting modules. They are unlike anything I've found in any other software before. The way the DAC works is it accepts 7 triggers as inputs, and depending on the combination of those triggers, it outputs analog value range from 0 to 127. This is excellent for pitch, modulation, velocity. The analog to digital converter is the opposite of that. It accepts an analog value range of 0 to 127, and then it outputs various bits, or various triggers, which are good for clocks and gates. And the logic behind this is that each input has a value. The first input is valued at 1, the second at 2, and then you just multiply each by 2. 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64. So if we were to plug in the first one, which is valued at 1, and then the second, which is valued at 2, we get an output value of 3. If we were to add the 1 and the 4, we'd get a 5, the 1 and the 8 for a 9, the 1 and the 64 for a 65. Now we can remove this and add, let's say, 2 to this value to create a 66. So when we feed various triggers to the inputs, then we get out shifting and repeating melodic patterns, kind of like this. I love that module so much. Really amazing melodies. The analog to digital converter is the exact opposite. It will accept the values such as 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, and then the corresponding trigger output will light up and output a trigger. So 1, as we know, corresponds to the first output, 2 corresponds to the second, and 64 corresponds to the last. Now when we add, say, 64 plus 1, what happens? The first output will light up. And if we plug the output of the DAC to the ADC, then we get the exact same triggers that we put in to come out like this, which we can then use on drums. So one thing that I forgot to mention is that the converters work hand in hand with the binary counter. So when we plug in the clocks and the triggers from the counter into the inputs, then it will ascend linearly. It will count up from 0 to 127, one number after the other. Now that is going way too fast to count. So we'll take 3 consecutive outputs like this, and this, which will then count up to 7. And this will count up to, I believe, 16 or 15. Okay, and then next we will be counting up to 31 with this. We can, of course, be sending this out to something. And if we were to plug all of these in, or at least 7 of them, we would be counting all the bits up to 127. And then if we were to use a normal clock, we would actually be counting backwards. So that's all there is. The binary counter is fun as a clock source, but it can be essential for precise counting with the B modes of the MUX, the Demux, and the converters.